research is definitely a way of life, and I'm pretty much always doing it, and it's always inspiring. It's one of the things that keeps me, going through 500 pages. And it almost never lets me down. And often I will find when I'm stuck, and I do get stuck despite all my big talk, that just a little more research will turn me on about something, and I'll go like, click, there it is, the thing I needed to know to get through to the end of this. And that'll all work out. It really works out for me in historical plots, because I can't tell you how often I have been stuck, and it turns out that some little known historical fact is far cooler than anything I could have invented. But in the surface detail, as I like to call it, of immersing the reader in the world that I've built, there is no substitute for looking at stuff people have made. And I am very inspired by stuff.
What is up, everybody? You're listening to episode 121 of SFF Addicts. I'm your host, Adrian M. Gibson, and welcome to your weekly dive into the world of science fiction, fantasy, and writing craft. Joining me, as always, my co-host, the Chewie to my Han Solo, the Joker to my Commander Shepard, MJ Kuhn. How's it going, MJ?
Hi, I am great. How are you?
I'm doing lovely. Peachy keen today. And just super peachy keen and wanting to promote my girl's books because she's amazing. And you can get Among Thieves, book 1 in the Tales of Timor duology, if you want to support MJ, this wonderful human being and her work, and it's complete. Unlike our guest today, whose series is actually 5 books, this is a complete duology, and you can pick it up right now.
That was I liked that a lot.
Yeah.
Right? That was good.
Yeah, my marketing skills on point.
If you want to support Adrian, check out Mushroom Blues, book 1 in the Hoffman Report. I almost called it the Hoffman Files. I don't know why. But anyways, it is Fungal Punk Noir goodness detective story with mushrooms and madness. Check it out.
Mushrooms and madness. I like it.
Adrian, while we're on this subject, how many Mushrooms and Madness books will there be?
In the Hoffman Report, 4, but in the broader Fungalverse, countless. I don't even know how many.
Millions.
A million.
As many as there are mushroom spores.
Yeah. Like spores. Okay, good.
So lots. If you like mushrooms, I got you covered for years to come. So don't you worry. As well, a quick note for everyone out there listening or watching, the official SFF Addicts Patreon and merch store are live, so check the links in the description to support what we do here. Also, don't forget to rate and view the podcast on your favorite podcast app, and subscribe to the FanFiAddict YouTube channel, where this and every other episode of the show is available in full video. And now, you've seen him already, but joining us once again is Christian Miles Cameron, author of Artifact Space, its new sequel, Deep Black, The Traitor Sun Cycle, and much, much more. Welcome back to the show, sir. How are you?
It's a great pleasure to be here. It's been a week since I've seen you guys.
It's been 5 years.
We did the reality TV show thing. We put the same clothes back on just to
Wow.
I took screenshots for everyone to have reference points.
So we can remember exactly what we wore.
MJ's continuity is impeccable.
Yeah.
Impeccable.
Also, she got a haircut again. Just so
again
for this.
Just for this.
Just for it.
Appreciate my dedication.
So dedicated. I appreciate you so much. A heads up, this is part 2 of our 2-part chat with Miles, so I recommend checking out part 1 to get to know him better. Today, though, we're cracking open the history books as we talk about researching for fantasy. So to start out, your fantasy novels are known, much of them, for their historical authenticity, but we had some teasers last episode about the depth that authenticity has to go into. So what importance does history play in your life and your creative process?
It's a lifestyle. There, I can pick up where I left off.
We got it.
Isn't that good?
That continuity is beautiful.
And I was just talking about my daughter, and you were just talking about your son, and I just want to take this opportunity to say right now, my daughter, if she's listening, is probably bursting into tears because she's never been on a family vacation that wasn't a research trip.
Oh no.
And I mean, it's not all bad because by the time she was 5 years old, I think she'd been to Greece 3 times and Italy twice or something. But yeah, so I'm utterly fascinated by, I don't know, the Mediterranean Bronze Age. So I've been to a lot of Mediterranean Bronze Age sites, and I think maybe the hardest thing to explain is how inspiring it is to actually be at a place where people built a gigantic tomb or a statue or whatever 4,000 years ago. And because sometimes there's very little to see. I remember we went to one of the, not the famous Thera, but an archaeological site in Greece called Thera on the island of Lesbos. And it's probably one of the very earliest trading towns that there ever was in the Mediterranean. Like, we're in 3000 BC here. We're at the dawn of the Bronze Age, and people are basically paddling dugout canoes around the Mediterranean. And I remember my daughter and I'm pretty sure my spouse looking at each other like, cool, what are we looking at? Because there's really nothing to see. And I found it very inspiring, and I walked over the like sort of mud rubble that archaeology has left, and of course I'd read the site reports, so I had some idea of what the site reports from the archaeologists, so I had some idea. And then I start boringly lecturing my poor wife and child on what the site would have looked like. And when we were done, I think they both thought, like, well, there's a beach nearby. Maybe we'll get to go to the beach if we're careful.
Right.
And that,
Careful. We cannot upset Professor.
it is a little bit like that. Yeah, and I've definitely ruined some family vacations demanding to go to places that turned out to be appallingly dull. That has definitely happened. But I love to see the actual stuff, whether the stuff in museums or the stuff. A couple of years ago, my daughter was actually going to school in Greece because she's as much as a nutter as me, and I convinced an archaeologist to take us to Gla, G-L-A, Gla, which is a Bronze Age fortress on a sort of hilltop in the middle of the Viotian plain, and it's where they ran their hydraulic system from. So they had a way of storing water in caves and then putting water out into the fields in the summer when they needed to irrigate the fields. That was extremely advanced. And so there we were in the driving rain of a Greek December. Don't think sunny Greek islands. Think more like Iowa. And we're standing there, and my daughter's like, so why are we here? And I'm like, well, sweetie, this is where they ran the hydraulic system from. And she's like pointing at the rain falling from the sky and says, here? Like right here? Anyway.
Like, wow, it's still working. Amazing.
Yeah, this hydraulic system is incredible.
Luckily, my family has a sense of humor. Anyway, research is definitely a way of life, and I'm pretty much always doing it. And as you suggested at the end of last episode, Adrian, it's always inspiring. It's one of the things that keeps me, going through 500 pages. And it almost never lets me down. And often I will find when I'm stuck, and I do get stuck despite all my big talk, that just a little more research will turn me on about something, and I'll go like, click, there it is, the thing I needed to know to get through to the end of this. And that'll all work out. It really works out for me in historical plots, because I can't tell you how often I have been stuck, and it turns out that some little known historical fact is far cooler than anything I could have invented. But in the surface detail, as I like to call it, of immersing the reader in the world that I've built. There is no substitute for looking at stuff people have made. And I am very inspired by stuff.
That's the
let's
quote.
talk
I'm very
about,
inspired by stuff.
very inspired by stuff. We're getting t-shirts made again. So in terms of being inspired by stuff and ruining family vacations, I wanted to ask, like, where your research process begins, and is it with those, like, is that the first step of your research process, is going, okay, I'm going to go and do a research trip? Or do you do some research before that stage? Like, how do you know what to focus on when you're really first starting to research a new project?
I don't know. I know that's a terrible answer, MJ, but so I started in the last episode to talk about this completely not historical, completely fantasy that is very loosely based on the Victorian world. And I can guarantee you that started when I was rereading Sherlock Holmes, like Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes. And I had a sort of an idea, and it was just a sort of an idea. And I have to warn you that I have a sort of an idea about every 5 minutes, and that they don't all end up as books.
Nor should they.
Sometimes,
But I go from sort of an idea to like, well, I'll do a little background reading. So my background reading was to get some back issues of the London Illustrated News of the late 19th century. And one book that really helped me get where I thought my brain was going was a book on First Nations and other guides in the Adirondacks. You guys know what the Adirondacks are? Adirondack Mountains of upstate New York.
Yeah.
And what made the Adirondacks unique is that they exist exactly at the same time as, say, Deadwood. That is, that the Adirondacks are to the eastern United States what sort of was going on in the West. So while we think of the Old West, which is mostly mythological and a giant lie, we almost never think of the Old East, or what was happening in the mountains of Appalachia, or what was happening in. So just to sum up, because everybody likes a historical factoid, it was far more dangerous to be on the streets of New York City than to be on the streets of Abilene or Dodge City or Deadwood. People shot each other every day in New York City, whereas interesting fact that no cowboy movie wants to tell you, it was illegal to wear a gun in public in Abilene, Texas. It was illegal to wear a gun in Dodge City. Things nobody wants to. It was not illegal to wear a gun in New York City.
But that's not fun and entertaining. Come on, man.
That's not very Wild West of you.
Bat Masterson, who was a fairly famous gunfighter from the Old West, ended up as a journalist in New York City, and he said New York City was a far more dangerous place than the West had ever been. Anyway, these are the things, though, that caused me to rethink writing, because I was sort of playing with the idea of writing a sort of fantasy Western. And I know it's been done, and it doesn't matter, because I was playing with that idea. And then I started reading about wilderness guides taking rich people into the wilderness in 19th century Canada and in the Adirondacks. And I thought that the ability to play with something that I find far too little of in steampunk, which is social class and labor unrest, the birth of socialism, all those, child labor, feminism and anti-feminism. These are all huge issues in the late Victorian period that often we sort of paper over with our airships and our automatons, and we don't choose to deal with the ugly underside of what an absolutely appalling time the Victorian period was. And then there's the beginning of the death of the wilderness, which is, because I'm a huge wilderness camper, something that really interests me. And so I really started digging into the Adirondack and Canadian part. And that, I just went from book to book. I discovered a guy named Murray who had written he wrote a series of, I think, 8 books called Adirondack Tales in the 1880s, and he was responsible for popularizing the Adirondacks for middle-class people to go and visit the Adirondacks. So I read all his books, and then I found other even earlier books, some of which were dreadfully racist and misogynist, and some of which were very readable from the 1860s and 70s. And I realized that the Adirondacks that I grew up with was largely given birth to by Civil War veterans who needed a place to go camping. Because, of course, they'd learned how to camp under appalling circumstances in a giant war. And then they kind of wanted to get away from their factories and out of their giant cities. Because say what you will about the American Civil War, and a lot of people died, a lot of young men who were used to working in factories discovered that they could go out and lie under the stars and live. Literally, that they could camp out and be comfortable and make their own fire, which was not the life of a city person in the Industrial Revolution. It's not something we think about a lot, and yet it became clear to me as I started to do research that this was a major impact on reason that people got on railway carriages, put canoes on railway carriages, and went up into the central Adirondacks, and then took wagons 20 miles and then carried their canoes another 4 miles just so that they could spend a week in the wilderness at $1 a day. Yeah. And somewhere in there, I began to put together the threads of a novel that, I don't know, isn't really about any of those things, and yet all of that research is part of it.
Right, but that's the thing. It's like so much of the research that we do as authors is very important and very formative for what the novel needs to be and what we want our stories to be, but a lot of it won't be apparent to the actual reader. But those are the things, like you were saying, like that surface detail, those are the things that we spend lots of time researching and digging into, and then they provide surface detail that actually allows the reader to be more engaged than if we were to just kind of indulge them with, I say indulge, but I really mean bore, with too much information, just like your families on the vacations. They're like, so
Yeah.
where's the beach? Where's the beach? And you've mentioned your, research trips masquerading as vacations and books. Are there other methods of research for you that you kind of lean towards? Are you using the internet quite often, or online journals, or do you prefer like books and in-person research?
So I prefer books and in-person research. I'll check up on things using the internet. Usually I'm just fact-checking myself. I like books. I like physical books. And I know it's just the way my brain is, but once I read something that interests me, I can usually find it again almost instantly in a book. And it's something about the reference in 3 dimensions, but I can tell you where it is on the page, whether it's on the left or right page, and how far through the book it is. So usually I can find my fact again pretty quickly. I can't do that with a Kindle. I have a lot of my research books on Kindle, and it's useless. It's useless compared to the speed with which I can find things in a real book. And so, and I have a trick which I recognize is a first world solution, but I recommend it to somebody who can afford to do it, which is a long time ago when I realized I needed a book for research, I would buy the first edition or the earliest intact edition, even if it was a lot more money, because it is a tax-deductible expense to buy that book for research. And now I'm building a library of books that themselves have value in case I ever need to sell them off to pay my mortgage.
Amazing.
Sorry, just a little. It's a lifestyle.
It's a
Yeah,
lifestyle.
right?
No, but that's
No,
a
it's
very,
good
very good
pro
little tip. Yeah.
Yeah.
And also old books. I just find old books beautiful. I love the way they smell. I love the way they feel. I love the fascinatingly weird illustrations. I am not alone in this. I know a lot of other fantasy writers but I just love all that stuff. But a shout out to science. It's not all about fantasy. So the magic system that I came up with and I'm talking about a book that is not sold, by the way. So I could be ruining this episode. But is based on my wife gave me a fabulous book on basically how magnetism and the Earth's crust interact. Completely modern hard science. I just read about 4 pages and went, damn, I can get a whole magic system out of this. And I thought, and I was right. Like, and it just flowed, because once I thought of my analogies, I was like, why hasn't somebody else done this? Like, the Earth has a magnetic field, right? The magnetic field is produced by basically the molten metal inside the Earth. Need I say more? Does that not inspire you with a magical system right off anyway? So, and I don't even know whether I can call that research, because research is when you're really getting deep into something. And sometimes I'm just sort of casually reading something and going, oh, well, that's cool. I'll get something out of that. Research is more like, yes, I have to go to Mycenae in Greece and I have to see the Lion Gate for myself. That's research. But often I'm just reading stuff and going, oh, that's cool, and that's also cool. And I completely agree with what you said, Adrian. Like, every new writer needs to realize it's not like everything from this book is making it into my book. Maybe it's one good idea. Maybe it's no good ideas. It just helped me along the way. It's like a signpost, right? Like, I have been inspired by a particular book. It was called Agents of Empire. And I was inspired, but by the time I wrote the series that it became, there was nothing of that book left. It just sort of started me on the road of invention and research.
Yeah. I love that too. I feel like I've had that so many times where it's like, oh, was this inspired by this? And it's like, well, maybe somewhere down, it all kind of percolates in the brain at some point. But I feel like we're kind of flirting with a very important question that I kind of want to talk about, which is the balance of the research and the creative freedom that you need in your fantasy setting, in your, like, for example, in your magic system, right? Where you're inspired by this hard science book. How do you go about balancing the elements you want to take from that research or that inspiration with the creative freedom that you're going to fully invent in your world, your magic, whatever it is you're creating?
Wow, MJ, I wish I knew. Like, I really, this is twice that I've given you that kind of answer.
Stumping ya.
Right? But no, it's sort of like a Cuisinart. Like, I just put it all in, and then the next morning something comes out. Like,
you just compare your brain to a crock pot.
Oh my God.
You would not be the first to make that comparison.
Just slow cooking these stories, baby.
I love that.
I don't know. I mean, it's all creative. Like, and ultimately, it's all ours, right? Like, no matter how many books you read, no matter how many trips you take, or what swords you swing or guns you shoot, when you sit down to write it down, it's out of your head. And I would even argue that even if the three of us agreed absolutely on 3 characters and a plot, we would write very different pieces, because that's the way it works, because we have different brains. So, even if the 3 of us sat around doing research, we took a vacation together, we did all the same research. And by the way, Sebastian de Castel and I have basically got a standing challenge to do this. We want to go to Venice, go to all the same museums, and then sit down and write a book in a month, because he writes as fast as I do.
I love that idea.
The idea would, well, that's great, Adrian, because what we were going to propose is actually take like a dozen of us so that we could make it like a thing. Like, go out to dinner every night, fence on the sword fight on the bridges. I was going to teach a sword class every day. No, seriously, and like get a dozen writers. And then, are you guys old enough to remember the Thieves' World books?
No,
Okay.
I don't believe so.
No.
Right. Well, they were the first shared world books. And they were wildly popular in the 80s. Anyway, my point was we could get a dozen writers and we could all write our own individual tank, and then we could publish it in a single volume. And anyway, that was what Sebastian and I imagined doing. And the stories would not be the same. They would be very different, because ultimately it's what's in your head and how you choose to describe it. And I don't know. And I feel that this is banal to say, and yet we're saying. So between the Iliad and the Morte d'Arthur, or the Arthurian tales, there are two fundamental Western sort of canon fantasy tales, because they're basically fantasy, that have been retold 1,000 times each. And yet, if you run your thumb down the New York Times bestseller list, there is almost always a representative of either the Iliad or the Arthurian tales of some sort. Sometimes it's literature, and sometimes it's fantasy or science fiction, but they're always there. And yet we're just telling the same story over and over and over and over again, and we're all perfectly willing to hear it told a different way. And that's, I guess, why it, in a way, doesn't matter how much research I do. It's still going to be my brain, or MJ's, or Adrian's.
But at the same time, I think it's like I like what you're saying, because it's like, even if you have the same experiences, there are so many different ways that people could interpret those experiences. And I coming up with the questions for this masterclass, I came up with this term of lived research, where you are actually experiencing the thing. And something like, we're going to go to Venice together, we're all going to live the research, we're going to visit the museums, we're going to sword fight on the bridges and stuff like that. You told me at Worldcon that I have a body for fencing, so maybe
You
I
do?
can start getting into it. But your experience with historical reenactment, for example, that is a very good representation of your personal lived research. And even if you are doing historical reenactment with other people in various forms, the way that they interpret that and then incorporate that into their own lives is different from the way that you're going to do it. So for you, how did you get into that in the beginning, and how has that sort of, like MJ was saying, percolated into your writing?
How I got into it was that when I was 14 years old, my Boy Scout troop had a bit of a difficulty of the kind that Boy Scout troops are more and more frequently revealed to have. And suddenly all of our dads were appearing at every Boy Scout meeting. And the Boy Scout troop master was gone. And he was replaced with a 26-year-old who announced to all of us that we weren't going to be a Boy Scout troop anymore. We were going to be a Revolutionary War reenactment group.
That took a very positive turn. I love it.
It was the American Bicentennial. It was 1975, and and off we went to Lexington and Concord. This is Massachusetts. I lived in Massachusetts, and we went off to Lexington and Concord to be American militia at the opening of the American Revolution. And I really never looked back on that. My dad was a theater tech professional, and he just loved making things, anything. And the great thing about reenacting is if you want to make anything, you can make anything. So we did leather work, and I learned to sew, and we made shoes, and we made hats, and I don't know, sky was the limit. And once you've done one reenactment period, the rest of them become pretty easy. I don't know if either one of you know how to sew, but once you learn to sew, all forms of cosplay are roughly equally far away or equally close. You want to do Puritans getting off the Mayflower, you want to do Star Trek officers, pretty much the same amount of sewing. The shoes for the Mayflower may be a little more of a challenge, but it's really all right there. Sewing is the gateway drug to all forms of reenactment. And eventually I learned to hand sew, and I learned to do a lot of things that were called fine sewing in the past, so that I could not only make things, but make things the way they made them as opposed to the way we'd make them now. And there's lots of people who can do that, and I learned to up my leatherwork. And in fact, leatherworking was my first serious job. I was a leatherworker for all the way through university because it paid really well and I could do it whenever I wanted. I can make a really, really good woman's handbag. I can.
MJ, you like send me a copy
I was gonna
of Deep
say
Black
my ears just perked
inside
up.
inside of a handbag.
Yeah.
Anyway, so having said that, I mean, that's how I got into it. I never stopped doing it, even when I was in the military. But then I got into what we used to call hardcore reenacting and is now called progressive reenacting. You can tell why maybe those terms changed, which is to immerse yourself as much as possible and try and be able to live completely with that period's kit and that period's food and that period's everything for an hour, a day, a week, 2 weeks. 2 weeks is as long as most of us would really like. And that's challenging and interesting and takes you to a whole different level, but it also gives you a lot more to write about. And after a while, you start discovering, well, I ended the last podcast by talking about women's corsets, but you really do discover when you make clothes well, when you make them to fit, when you make them accurately in the way they used them, that every time period and every culture, China, American First Nations, Africa, ancient Egypt, ancient Greece, their clothes were always perfectly suited to their climate, their culture, and their way of life. And you also learn that sometimes their clothes are very badly suited to your way of life, like when we tried to do ancient Greek reenacting in Canada during mosquito season. Because
Oh no.
so much skin revealed for all those mosquitoes.
so much skin revealed. And by contrast, the First Nations clothing of the early white contact period is some of the most effective woodswear for the Canadian wilderness you'll ever have. And really, after we'd been trekking for years in sort of 17th and 18th century stuff, we're like, why would we ever go back to modern camping equipment, which is so badly designed by comparison? Because First Nations people lived it. That was their whole lives. They weren't just going out in the woods on weekends. And anyway.
But what about stuff like armor? How does that perhaps complicate or add complexity to the whole reenactment process?
Well, it's virtually useless wearing in the woods, let me tell you, because I've worn a lot of armor in the woods. Although here's a fun fact that may surprise you. You would think that knights would be at a huge disadvantage in heavily forested terrain, but no. See, when nothing can hurt you, you can just run through the branches and you don't care what hits you in the face. And so here's a fun fact for a scene that if you ever want to the person without armor running away from the knight in the woods, the knight is always going to catch him because he doesn't have to duck for the branches. He doesn't care.
It's like a human tank.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, he just splinters the branches and runs on through. Anyway, so one of the first things I learned about armor, I owned my first suit of armor when I was 17. And I learned to fight in that armor because I was in the SCA. But pretty early on, I learned that, the phrase garbage in, garbage out that we were taught early on in the computer revolution, that is equally true of trying to learn how the past works. So unless your suit of armor is made exactly like theirs and it's made to fit like theirs and you wear it over the same undergarments they wore, what you're learning is not worth learning. And really, the world is full of people who have put badly fitted armor over modern arming clothes and decided that it's all desperately uncomfortable and hard to wear. But that's not true. They just didn't have the right armor. And that is a painful process because even the cheapest suit of armor costs thousands of dollars, and a really good suit of armor costs a lot of thousands of dollars. And getting it wrong is always much more expensive than getting it right, but no one can tell you that initially. So it's not just the one suit of armor. It's all the suits of armor that get you to the one suit of armor where you get to start learning how it all works. Same thing was true with ancient Greek armor. Holy crap, the time I spent on ancient Greek armor doing it wrong before I figured out, with the help of much, much, much better educated people than me, how to do it right. And that's all research too. And there's a lot of research. And there's a lot of overcoming what we call reenactorisms, but which might just be called bad or mythological history, where everyone knows something and it takes you years to figure out that that was wrong. That whole thing that everyone knew that you based your whole kit on, it's not true. So if you watch a lot of people who fight in armor, they're wearing very heavily, thickly padded clothes under their armor. There's almost no evidence for that. The truth is that armor was meant to be worn virtually over street clothes, over close-fitting, comfortable clothes that fit almost as tightly as a wetsuit. And armor didn't go over padding because you weren't standing in brutally hot sun exchanging blows for 8 or 9 hours with someone like modern fighters do. That wasn't the point. Anyway, I could go on, but there's so much to know about armor and about different periods in armor and about Chinese armor and Japanese armor, and then early, like different periods in Chinese and Japanese and Greek and whatever. Back in the dayism is a huge problem when you're doing research because it's very easy to imagine that 325 BC and 425 BC are pretty much alike, but they're no more alike than 1870 and 1970, and that's pretty far apart. And I remember very early on in researching ancient Greece when a whole bunch of people who were all sitting around my living room started to figure out that there were fashions in women's clothes in ancient Greece, and we could follow the change in fashion on pottery. And somehow no one had ever written about this. Like, there wasn't a book, because even art historians do this back in the day thing where they're like, oh, well, 450 BC, 425 BC, like, would fashion really change? Well, as far as I can tell, yes.
Right?
How
Like,
fashion
has
changed?
fashion changed since
like from
2000 when we all
right.
had tiny little eyebrows and frosted tips?
Yeah, but
puka shell necklaces.
Right.
but MJ, there's an important part of history called historiography, and in the study of historiography, which is just the study of how we study history, one of the things we know is that we're always studying ourselves. We always, every time period, when they look at the past, just wants to see themselves. So a lot of our history of the ancient world was written by English men of the late 19th and early 20th century. And as they imagined they lived in a timeless, male-dominated society, they imagined that everyone else lived in a timeless, male-dominated society. And apparently they were such fucking misogynists, they couldn't even notice that the women they hung out with had fashion that changed. Apparently that was utterly lost on them. Yeah, a lot of the books that you would still go to a library and get on ancient Greek fashion are written by men in the 1920s, and they apparently didn't know all kinds of things.
Yeah.
Interesting. Well, I want to circle back a little bit to the armor because I want to talk about combat and your combat scenes and the realism in them and the research that you have to do for that. I'm thinking specifically like historical combat techniques because thinking just beyond, obviously the armor is going to be a piece of this, but like what about sword fighting styles or specific weapons, things like that? Like, what's your process for researching these things and translating them into a fantasy setting?
The same as the process for understanding camping or anything else. I like to hold it in my hand and make it work for me. But like what I just said about armor applies doubly to martial arts. garbage in, garbage out. You really need to know what you're dealing with. So if you buy a really large sword and swing it around and then decide you now understand how really large swords work, the odds that you're wrong are very, very, very high, because when you buy a really large sword, is it actually an accurate reconstruction of a very, very large sword that was actually used in history? Because if it wasn't, and by the way, this is a probably terrible thing to say to a lot of writers, but I'm only interested in historical martial arts because I believe that over the last 35,000 years, and I mean 35,000 years, human beings have used weapons all the ways that they can possibly be used. I don't believe that there is a sword design, a nunchuck design, a rope design, a weapon design that human beings have not played with at some point in the last 35,000 years. And so when I look at a fantasy sword, a quote-unquote fantasy sword, I can immediately look at it for weight and balance and utility and go like, that would never work. And sometimes the reason it would never work is because it's too long to draw, or it's the way the quillins are made may look great in a Frank Frazetta painting, but it will catch on your chainmail every time when you draw it, which will inevitably get you killed. And a lot of other things. And I'm sorry to say this because this is a very typical entitled 62-year-old white male thing to say, but it takes time to learn all these things. Like, to practice enough martial arts to be able to look at a martial art and go like, oh, that probably works like that, and that probably works like that, and that the biomechanics of that is that, and that's how you cut with it. Okay, I get it. That is not an overnight skill. And yeah, and that sounds really, really sort of self-satisfied of me, but that's the truth. Like, I did not get here right away. And I have definitely been at 5 or 6 different times in my life where I thought, now I actually understand all of sword-based martial arts. Yeah, and I'm humble enough to not maybe say that out loud now, or maybe I suspect it's true. Anyway, but when I want to write about a particular martial art or a particular sword, I try and learn it. I try and learn at least enough of it to understand how it flows, how it works, what its advantages and what its disadvantages are. All martial arts and all weapons are cultural artifacts, exactly like dance and cooking. They are not efficient. They're never efficient. It's not about killing people. It's about killing people in a way that your society views as cool or at least acceptable. So Americans like to win wars with jet aircraft. They like the jet aircraft to be sexy looking. They like them to be invulnerable and fast and show our technological proficiency. That's not how Afghanis like to win wars. And it's not even how the English like to win wars. Different cultures produce different ideas of what winning is, of what looking cool as a man is. And I don't say that because I don't believe women are good at war. It's because up until very recently, war was a male dominant profession, and so a lot of it was about how men pictured themselves and how they pictured being cool. And it's funny because this is where fantasy blends perfectly with history, is that if you think that the coolest thing would be somebody in all black armor with a giant sword and a cloak fluttering behind them, guess what? So did thousands of other people in some historical period, because cool is kind of one of the dominant cultural effects in war. And when I try and understand a martial art, one of the first things I try and understand, because I also love dance, and dance works the same way, is what about this is cool? Or what about this was cool to the people who were doing it? Like, what's their special thing? So the Italians in the Renaissance had a term, sprezzatura, which is the perfect male behavior under pressure. And sprezzatura is where you make the joke, the witty jibe, the whatever, even when your head is about to be cut off. You're still that. And now our idea of cool masculinity is more Rambo or Arnold Schwarzenegger or whatever, but we still have a little bit of that, like, Italian cool. We like our witty banter, right? We like our superheroes to have the witty banter. So trying to understand the cool and how it goes with the martial art, it's also good writing, right? Because everybody likes the witty banter. Everybody likes to understand the cool. And by the way, I think one of the best things, I'm thinking of Scott Lynch, I'm thinking of Joe Abercrombie, Mark Lawrence, Anna Smith Spark, is people who can write to the cool, where they've made up the cool and then they teach you how it works and then you appreciate it. Right? And that is like a great form of fantasy. And yeah, I've sort of wandered off my topic, MJ, and I'm sorry, but
No, we got into a
No,
good place.
you didn't.
like
I mean,
this.
I feel like when we wander is oftentimes when we get to like the best shit. So
Yeah. Yeah, but also like that cool factor can be represented in so many different facets of uh sort of your world. It doesn't necessarily have to just be the cool factor in combat. It can be like what makes I think cool can be broadened to something that is engaging, something that is just generally interesting to the reader enough to pull them deeper into the world that you've created. But it's like you could kind of pull them deep into interesting political systems, interesting cultures, and across your work, your fantasy, your sci-fi, all of it, you do an amazing job of creating engaging characters who inhabit complex systems and show the reader this thing is interesting, like the politics of this particular city or of this particular world are interesting, the culture is unique and interesting, and those kinds of details that pull them in deeper and deeper. So for you, how is it to kind of like use maybe the real world but also your imagination to create engaging systems across your different stories?
well, Adrian, first of all, you used my magic word, system, because I love systems. And, for the middle part of my military career, I was an intelligence analyst. And mostly what you do is analyze systems, your own and potential adversaries. And so when I was writing the Trader Sun books, the sort of apparently medieval fantasy, there were systems I actually wanted to teach the reader about. They're real medieval systems. Most people don't know they're there. And I wanted to explain, for instance, where the money for war comes from, or how very expensive war was in the Middle Ages, what it would be like to fight a constant war with the wild, how much it would cost to society to be in that war all the time. And then, like somewhere in there, I read several books on the medieval fur trade and went like, oh, this is great. The fur trade. I'll tell a story about fur trading in the medieval context, and that will also explain where the money comes from that runs my mercenary company.
And when most people hear
But
fur trading, they don't necessarily think medieval. It's usually North American colonization, and that's sort of the association with something like the fur trade.
Yeah, so here's the fascinating thing. The fur trade was a 400-year-old exploitive colonial horror show before it ever came to America.
Right, yeah.
It had become expert at genocide and large-scale ecological change by killing every beaver in Europe, all the way to east of the Urals. Like, there wasn't a squirrel large enough to make. So, do you know that Cinderella's slippers are made of vair, which is fur, not glass? That is an 18th century mistranslation of the French. her slippers were fur slippers. They were squirrel fur slippers, not glass slippers. Just
That
bad
sounds like nowhere near as cute of a shoe, though.
Right. Cinderella, come get your squirrel slippers.
Come get your squirrel shoes.
But can't you imagine what Disney could have done with that?
Right.
Anyway, leaving this aside, they could have squeaked when she walked in them. She could have had even smaller feet.
The comedic possibilities, they're endless.
The point is that the Anglo-German fur trade had exterminated virtually every fur-bearing animal in Europe. And they were literally running out. Like, they couldn't get a hold of any beaver or marten or any of the major furs. And ding, they found a whole new continent with like whole new oppressible First Nations peoples who they could engage in. Anyway, I won't be horrible, because sometimes when you're being horrible, even sarcastically, it doesn't come out well. But yeah, Europeans just in time found a whole new continent that they could get furs out of. And I hadn't realized till I was in the middle of writing the Red Knight books that there was this medieval fur trade. I knew they had fur, but I hadn't sort of put it all together. And in the process of reading about the fur trade, I was like, oh my goodness, I know what horror must underpin the whole economic way my world works. And that's what I was talking about earlier when I said sometimes I'm just rescued by history. Like, the right book falls into my hands and I'm like, oh, never mind, I do know where the money comes from. And I don't know, this may be a failing. This may be why the vacations aren't as good as they could be, but I have to know how it all works. And this goes back to your earliest world building questions in episode 1. I can't let well enough alone. I need to know where the money comes from. I need to know how the peasants live. I need to ask the hard questions about whether the society is on average terrible. Even if I'm portraying it as good, I need to know in my head whether it's really oppressive. And I can't stop either. And I have sometimes discovered that I disliked my creation when it's too late to stop it, which then sort of warps the rest of what I'm talking about. Anyway, good times, good times.
It's
I just wrote it.
Oh no!
I just wrote a trilogy set in a completely fantasy Bronze Age, where I sort of mixed up a whole pile of cultures that I fully admit most people probably haven't even heard of, all of which were around in humanity's Bronze Age, but sometimes at very different times. So, like, there's Mesoamericans and there's South Americans, like the Pache people. And that was really, really fun, except when they thought I had written Greco-Roman mythology. But I leave that aside. It was really... It was
Go listen
really
to last
fun.
episode to hear how much Miles hates genres.
But it was really, really fun looking at Bronze Age systems, because I'm a medievalist, and to all of a sudden be going like, wow, they had running water. They had all kinds of great stuff in the Bronze Age. And what originally attracted me to the Bronze Age, quite frankly, and I speak as a person who lives with modern day global climate change and the possibility of Donald Trump's reelection, the thing that fascinates me about the Bronze Age is it fell. It fell. They had it all, and they lost it. And basically, everyone died. Like, boom! Oh, well, agriculture collapsed. They basically lost all of the Mediterranean, and a good deal of Asia, too, just sort of lost the ability to produce agriculture and lost the ability to produce what we would now call civilization. And 4/5 of the population died. Oh, yeah. Good job, everyone.
For anyone who's interested, go check out more about the Bronze Age collapse, because it is fascinating and so fucking terrifying.
Maybe terrifying to read in 2024, honestly.
It's right on the nose, right? You're just like, oh my God, you mean this happened? You mean like, and large-scale erosion caused them to lose all their topsoil and then they just starved and died? Yeah, good job. Good job, humanity.
Oh my God.
We made it.
Well,
we made it at least.
We made it. We made it to the... Oh, I'm so so glad we might get to experience our own collapse. Let's not though. So you talked about though that you can't leave well enough alone and you always have to dive into the details. I'm curious to kind of start wrapping us up here. How do you know when you've done enough research and when it's time to start writing? Do you return to research while you're writing? Do you, I mean, because I, as a person who can world build until I'm blue in the face and procrastinate actually starting drafting for 900 years, how do you not do that?
So, MJ, it's a lifestyle. So I never stop. See,
You're always
I love the way I'm
Can't
always
stop, won't
researching.
stop. Just
And
always researching.
I stop researching a novel when I stop writing it. Um, and this can be very disappointing to my friends, by the way. Right now, if any of my gaming friends are listening and they're like, that bastard gets us where we all sit around painting Bronze Age armies and then suddenly it's Victorians and he's like, no, we're not playing Bronze Age anymore. Now we're playing Victorian. Yeah, because that's how I am. I'm like, done. It's done. I'm not writing about that anymore, so I don't need that anymore. And we haven't talked about gaming, which is a huge source of inspiration for me. So maybe you'll have me back another time to talk about gaming. But uh, yeah, so MJ, I'm actually totally with you. So I wrote Artifact Space in 45 days. I've already said that, like whoosh. But then I had to write the sequel, and Deep Black did not come to me in a fit of inspiration. I had to write it. And to make that even worse, Artifact Space is in some ways just half a story. And I think this is where the idea that it's a duology started, because the two books really go together. They're part of a much bigger story, but you might call, they're there and back again, like out and back. So I totally understand. The problem is that I sent Marka out into space, and even I didn't really, literally, I'm discovering every day as I'm writing what's going on. I didn't even know the starfish were going to be part of the book until we were like a third of the way through the book, and I'm like, oh my God, there's an alien race. Oh my God. And Dorcas keeps looking at these circles, and like I'm literally wondering, like, where did that come from? I'm watching the words form on the page. Circles, like there's circles, like what are these left over from another alien civilization? Christian, what are you thinking? And I'm like, maybe I'll go back and change this. I don't know. And then somewhere I discovered the meta plot around like page 450, and I'm like, oh my God, so there's going to be another book, because I had promised Gillian Redfern it was a standalone at this point, and I'm not.
No, you
With
said it's how many
serious
books?
potential.
Yeah. All of which I'm really trying to please MJ to say. So when I sat down to write Deep Black, first I did my usual thing. I sandbox stories, so you'll never see them. I'll just write 3,000 or 4,000 words to get to know a character, or to get to know a situation, or to tell myself a story. So I'm like, oh yeah, this is how I want this to go down. The thing is that by the time I'd written 4 or 5 sandbox stories, I realized I had a book of short fiction. So I managed to put that out as Beyond the Fringe, and those were really sandbox stories to tell me what was going on in my own universe that wasn't on the bridge of the Athens. And then I discovered a computer program. See, this is my long-winded way of saying I'm just like you, MJ. I discovered an app called World Anvil, and another called Incarnate. And together they allow me as a role-playing game addict to create perfect maps and then catalog them. Except that I went a lot farther than that. I basically spent more than 40 days just making my Artifact Space universe. And like, I wish I could show it to you. It is in so much detail. And remember, I wrote the first book in 45 days, and then I spent 40 days building maps, collecting illustrations, writing a whole encyclopedia on the DHC and who all the personalities in the DHC are and how a whole bunch of things work. But then against that, when I sat down to write Deep Black, it was super helpful to know all those things. Because honest to God, I had not known them when I wrote Artifact Space. They were like a big surprise every day.
You're like, well, shit, I should probably codify this stuff.
So I don't think that was a waste of time. And I enjoyed it thoroughly, but I've never done that. Like, I've done a ton of world building before. I've never done it so upfront, like so deliberately, here we go. So when I started my Victorian fantasy, which is called The Land, by the way, I did that first. So I made a whole bunch of maps, which I usually do anyway, and I filled in name lists, and I did a lot of looking at flavor because I was looking at a lot of original Victorian stories, especially stories about camping. And then there were literally words I wanted to use because we don't use them all the time now. And to me, they're very evocative and very Victorian. Anyway, I've never done that before, so that's a whole new like jumping off point. But is it really? Am I really avoiding work? I mean, see, if it ends up as a book, then no. That's all. Like I don't know if I was just trying to avoid work. In the end, it seems to be working.
Yeah.
It helps.
Yeah. I mean,
in fact, I would, for people who aren't, I don't know, veteran role playing gamers or whatever the hell I think my trick is, for people who have to do world building, I would actually recommend World Anvil. It takes a couple days to figure it out. It's not the nicest interface. I know they'd hate my saying that, and they have all these videos on how to use it better, which is great. But it doesn't matter. Watch the videos, learn to use it, and then you have a way of cataloging all your thoughts that might help some people. It helped me.
well,
I'm not familiar with this tool, but I'm stoked about it. Yeah.
I actually did a Worldcon panel with one of the creators of.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Interesting.
It was like a panel about the art of the interview, because they also have a podcast where they interview authors who use their platform.
They do.
And
yet they've never interviewed me.
I'll email her and be like, hey, I got some suggestions.
There you go. So be the beginning of something beautiful.
Exactly. But I like that. It's like anything you're doing here, I think researching, yes, you can call it procrastination in some form, but I think if it produces a book, then
productive procrastination.
Yeah, exactly. Productive procrastination. If it produces a book, then you've done something right along the way. And if you spend 10 years and you still don't have that book, figure shit out. But
I mean, okay. I have a comment to make to that too, Adrian. Which
okay.
I'm going back to one of my panels at Worldcon, which was late stage capitalism, like how to survive late stage capitalism. And my argument, which I ripped off from a better socialist than I'll ever be, is like the good versus goods. Like the good, like if you love what you're doing, you're winning. You're beating late stage capitalism because they don't want you to love anything except money, the acquisition of money, and the acquisition of stuff. And if you manage to turn that on its head and love doing research, building your world, anvil world, whatever, that's not procrastination. That's life. That's why I keep saying it's a lifestyle, because you have to like it all, I think, to be a full-time writer. You have to like the whole process by which you produce your craft all the time, because you can't really turn it off. You can't really take a vacation. Right? MJ's shaking her head.
Yeah, I was going to say, yeah. It is. I heard someone say once that being a writer is giving yourself really hard homework for the rest of your life. And it's true.
But it's homework that we enjoy.
But it's homework that we enjoy. You have to love it. Yeah.
And that's why it's good versus goods. I stole this from the former Greek minister of finance, because goods, you're just producing something that sells, leatherwork, whatever. But the good is something that makes you happy.
Yeah.
And anytime that you can produce something that makes you happy, you're winning. That's my view.
That is a beautiful note to end on. It's a lifestyle, people. Enjoy it. Love it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And thank you again, Miles, for doing this mini masterclass with us. We really appreciate it. It's been a wonderful time.
Well, you guys are great interviewers, and I think you're the masters, but I have very much enjoyed this. And if you ever want to do tabletop role-playing games as my other giant nerdy inspiration, I'm here to talk.
If anyone wants to see, just go check out. If you're watching this on the FanFiAddict YouTube channel, you can go check out his RPG sessions from TBRCon, past TBRCons. Yeah, there's a bunch, and they're fantastic. Yeah. Well, yeah. I'm just buzzing. I got a good vibe from all this. It makes me feel good about doing research about things that I'm just really interested in, because it's a vibe. Right? It's a lifestyle.
Yeah. It also counts as work. Never tell yourself you're procrastinating, MJ. I'm angry at you.
I love this. I've just been given a license to world build forever.
That's another part of the writing. Beautiful. That's another part of the writing thing. It's like the self-loathing and all that shit.
Right?
We just gotta push that aside a little bit.
Right.
Oh my god. All right. Well, for anyone who contributes to our Patreon at $5 or more each month, you can hear a little bit more of Miles' voice as he reads to you from Deep Black. So go check that out. You can also go pick up any of his books. You've got a lot to choose from. If you want historical fantasy, if you want fantasy, if you want sci-fi, you got it all. You got 50 books to choose from. So go pick 1 to 50 of them and just buy them all and support.
Just buy them all.
Buy them all and support this beautiful human
all
being.
50.
One day you got to do like a collection, be like a box set.
One omnibus.
Yeah, exactly.
That does sound like a good idea.
Maybe not an omnibus, but a box set. Fucking gigantic thing. Oh my god. All right. Where can people find you online?
You can find me at Fokion1 on Twitter, and Christian Cameron Author is my website, and I believe that is also my handle on both Instagram and YouTube. And you can look at #WritingFighting, which I pretty much own, or look at my Writing Fighting episodes on YouTube. I have 200 of them. And by the way, let me just say as a shout out to all writers everywhere, I provide consulting services on all forms of fighting, from small to warfare, because I've also led armies on horseback and know what it's like to give orders on horseback and other fun things that most people haven't experienced. And I don't kiss and tell. I don't tell when I help people. So if you ever want to consult, just write me a note and we'll talk about it, and then I will disappear and never claim any credit.
Amazing. All right. Well, you can also follow SFF Addicts on Instagram, Twitter, Threads, all that jazz at sffaddictspod. You can follow me at Adrian M. Gibson. You can go get a copy of Mushroom Blues in ebook, paperback, and hardcover. MJ, what about you?
Yep, you can find me across all the major socials at MJ Kuhn Books. You can find my website at mjkuhn.com, and you can buy my books to feed my cat. He's a very hungry boy.
There is a good reason. What's your cat's name?
His name is Thorin Oakenshield.
Yeah.
Oh, he is Thorin. That's your Thorin. Okay, got it.
Support the Thorin.
That's my Thorin. Yeah. Thorin Food Fund.
All right. Go support the TFF, and we will see you all soon. For now, keep reading, keep imagining, and we'll see you next time on SFF Addicts.